Hello everyone and welcome to another really awesome game between Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen. It's from the World Under 14 Championship that was played in Greece. So this is their third encounter altogether. Actually, we've already shown the first encounter that was from the European Under 12 Championship. If you guys haven't seen that one, it will be the first link in the description below. So maybe you want to check out that one before going into this one, as this is kind of a prelude to the World Chess Championship match that will be played in November this year. So this is their third encounter. Second one was in the, I believe, World Under 12 Championship, and this is now the World Under 14 Championship. It's a really tough crowd. The competition is great, and you guys will enjoy this game. So Nepo, with the white pieces, opens with e4. We have c5 by Magnus, going for the Sicilian defense. It's very interesting. Is this something that we will see also in their 2021 World Chess Championship match? And here Nepo goes for c3, the Alapin variation of the Sicilian, preparing d4. So here d5 by Magnus. It's a very standard response when white plays a move like c3, because the pawn on c3 is preventing the knight from coming to c3. So you actually don't mind e captures on d5 and queen captures. White will not have this extra tempo of just dislodging the queen from d5. So d4 by white, and now usually black will just play something like knight f6, knight to c6, but Magnus goes for pawn to g6. He wants to fianchetto his dark square bishop. We have knight to f3, and now bishop to g7. We have knight to a3. Now, as we said, the c3 square is not available, but also the knight covers the c4 square, and we can kick away the queen with bishop to c4. So c captures on d4, and now Magnus, Nepo develops the bishop to c4 and attacks the queen before recapturing the pawn here. So queen to e4, check by Magnus, and now Nepo plays bishop to e3, and we've already reached a position from the thumbnail. It's quite an interesting one. Why did Nepo do this? Can Magnus capture this? Well, if he captures this, the problem is there's bishop captures on f7. And now, if of course this d file is not available to the king, the queen covers both squares, so you have to capture, and if knight g5 check, you lose the queen. And if you don't capture, you could play king f8, but you still will have to capture. Queen d8 check forces the capture on f7, now knight g5 check, and again, you blunder your queen. So you actually can't capture this bishop on e3. So Magnus continues with knight to h6, now defends the f7 pawn, so it seems like we're ready to capture this bishop, but Nepo again with another very nice trick, knight to b5, now saying, okay, are you maybe interested in the bishop now? But again, if the bishop is captured, then it's just a very nice checkmate in 2. Knight c7 check, only move king f8, and queen to d8 will be checkmate. So Magnus, of course, not interested in that. He just castles kingside, and c captures on d4. Finally, Nepo wins back his pawn. Knight to a6 now, now taking away the c7 square from white's knight, and now Nepo just goes back. Knight to c3. We have queen back to c6. The queen is attacked, now attacking the bishop, and here we have queen to b3, and it is now, as of move 12, that this position has never been reached again since it was played. So knight to f5, bringing the knight back into the game, attacking the bishop on e3, and now we have castles kingside. And I just realized I haven't mentioned this was played in 2003, if anyone is interested. So here, queen to b6, Magnus offers a queen trade. He wants to go straight in for the endgame, as his queen not doing all that much on c6, white queen and bishop doing a lot of damage here along this diagonal. You can't really get the rook into the game, so it makes sense to get the queens off the board, and Nepo complies. We have queen captures on b6, a captures, and now knight to a4, going after Magnus's b6 pawn. So what do you play here? Well, Magnus starts with knight to d6. He says, go after the pawn here, because if you go after it, I'm just gonna capture on c4, and that's it. Okay, you've won a pawn, you have to capture back, and then I just continue development, but I have the bishop pair. And if you go for knight captures on a8, that is not a free rook there. I'm just gonna play bishop to f5, attack your knight here, and the knight has no way of entering the game. And if rook 8 to c1, attacking the knight, we're just gonna capture on e3, f captures and rook captures on a8, and you will have the bishop pair for a rook, which is of course something no one would play unless the position really asks for it, you know, and if it was like a necessity. So bishop back to b3, and now knight to b4. Very active with those knights, but the b6 pawn is now definitely free for grabs, and Nepo captures it. So knight captures on b6, attacks the rook, rook to a6, and now knight back to d5. We have a trade here, knight captures, bishop captures, and now bishop to f5. So Nepo is now up a pawn, and where is the compensation? Both players still have the bishop pair, and there is this 2-to-1 advantage on the queen side, so that's something that Nepo is definitely interested in playing for if he can somehow create a pass pawn. So rook f to c1, getting the rook to the only open file on the board makes sense, and rook to a5 by Magnus, going after the bishop here, forcing the bishop to maybe move to b3, which is what was played in the game. But also very interesting here is just rook c5. Here Nepo could ask Magnus, what are you planning with that rook? What's the idea behind it? Because if you capture, then the problem is, yes, you can now capture on b2, but after bishop captures on b2, rook to d1, what do you play here? It's a really tricky position, so we could play something like e6, but then we're just gonna capture this e6 pawn. The knight is hanging, so if you move the knight, you're gonna lose this pawn, and again we get two pass pawns, not one. So here you might play something like e6, but then bishop captures, f captures, and c captures on d6. Again, Nepo with this beautiful pass to d6 pawn. So instead, Nepo went bishop back to b3, and now we have bishop to e4. Very important, you want to keep this defender here, but also put pressure here on the knight. If Nepo allows it, we might be interested in doubling white's pawns here, but we don't see it. So knight to d2 attacks the bishop. Now bishop back to c6, doesn't allow any rook lifting via rook to c7. So Magnus is saying, all right, I have the bishop pair, you're up a pawn, prove that this is good for white. So bishop to c2 by Nepo now. You could also force some trades with knight to c4, attacking the knight and the rook here, but first we have bishop to c2, and now rook to d8. Now Magnus is planning to put a lot of pressure on this pawn here. It's an isolated pawn, so we're attacking it once. We might attack it again with this rook. The bishop is attacking it. The knight can come to f5 or b5 to attack it. So there are many ways for us to go after that pawn. So bishop to d3, and now rook to d5, adding another attacker, and now knight f3, adding another defender here. And now what do you play here? Rook to h5. This is a very interesting move. It looks almost as a waiting move. Other than that, I don't see really the idea behind the rook h5 move. If any of you guys have any ideas on why rook h5 was played, you're more than welcome to share in the comments so we can discuss it. But here we have bishop to e2, now threatening some nasty discoveries, and Magnus just goes back, rook to d5. So it could be a waiting move, just waiting to see what Nepo will do. But now Nepo says, I'm not interested in your waiting moves, I'm just going to play g4, take away the h5 and f5 squares, and now you are forced to come up with some sort of a plan. Okay, you could attack this pawn, maybe we trade, for example, h3, captures, but opening of the h file doesn't really seem to be suiting anyone. If anything, it could be good for white at some point, but for black, not really at the moment. So instead, we have knight to b5, now really putting pressure on that d4 pawn, and now bishop to c4, attacking the rook, so Carlsen moves it to d6, and now knight to e5, now going after the f7 pawn, so you don't really have time to collect here on d4, and sorry about that, let me just do something. All right, so after this knight to e5 move, we have e6, not allowing any bishop or knight captures on f7, and only now bishop captures on b5. We eliminate one of the attackers of the d4 pawn. Another idea here is just capturing the bishop. Because you can't really capture with the rook, then the knight hangs, so you have to capture with the pawn, but this just means that we've created a beautiful pass pawn here. Nepo does it in a similar way. He first captures on b5, and only after bishop captures now pushes a4, and now you can't really go to c6 because of the capture here. White would very happily trade twice to create this pass pawn, so bishop has to go all the way back, and now b4. So now Nepo wants to push his two pawns and then create a pass pawn this way. So both maneuvers have their advantages, but the other one just creates a pass pawn right out of the bat. And here Magnus has to figure out on how to continue this position, so he decides to go for rook captures on d4. He says, all right, your bishop was very impressive here, I'm gonna sacrifice the exchange here, and this will put a lot of pressure on your position. So bishop captures, rook captures, and now the knight is hanging, the b4 pawn is hanging, and of course if the knight moves, the g4 pawn is hanging with check. So what can Nepo do here? Well, he goes for rook to c8. Now of course rook captures on e8 will come with check, so Magnus has to defend defend this, we have king to f8, and now rook to e1, just defending this knight and asking black what do you want to do. And here, if Magnus wanted to really trade down, he could just play something like captures, rook captures with on g4 with check, king f1, and now it could be a bit too dangerous to go after the this pawn here. For example, if rook captures on b4, then you might even run into something like rook to b5 because the bishop is pinned and you're going to have to trade rooks here. So it'd be very, very dangerous. Of course, if rook captures on a4, then we play rook captures on b7, and now after the rook comes here, it's just dead lost. So after king to f1, you're going to have to play something like king to e7, and you will not have time to recollect those pawns. Now this is possible, and black would have maybe even a decent game here. But after rook to e1, rook captures on b4. Magnus wants to keep chances alive. He just collects another pawn, and now h3, defending this pawn here. We have rook captures on a4, grabbing another pawn, and now knight to c4. Nepo is now threatening knight to d6 to win material here, and that would be game over. So king to e7 has to be played, and now rook to d1, cutting off the king from the entire d file. Well, maybe even going for some rook lifts. Knight to d6 again becomes an option. The rook now defends this, so you have to be very careful. The real question is, can a bishop to c6 be played? Because if it can, then it's again very good for Magnus. For example, bishop to c6, if rook to c7 check, king f6, now knight d6, going after rook captures on f7. It looks like it's dead lost for black, but there is this g5 move that keeps black alive. For example, rook captures on f7, king to g6, and now if rook to e7 going after this pawn, bishop d5 can defend both pawns, so it can be played. But it's such an ugly line. Magnus just goes for a completely different idea. He already sacrificed one exchange. He decides to sacrifice another one. So rook captures on c4, rook captures on c4, and now bishop to c6, with the bishop guarding the b7 pawn. And now we have this very, very rare endgame. You will not find this endgame in any endgame manual or tutorial or endgame book, a bishop pair against a rook pair. So how can you play this? Black is up 2 pawns, but rooks are rooks. But it's very hard to coordinate those two rooks in between the two bishops, because the bishops just slice the entire board completely. And well, can white actually make progress here? So Nepo starts with f4. We have f5 by Magnus. This will allow him to create a passed pawn. He just wants to capture on g4, and after h captures, push h5, and then we're gonna have a passed pawn regardless of what white plays. So king f2, now comes f captures on g4, h captures, and h5. Now this ensures a passed pawn for Magnus. G captures on h5, g captures on h5, and now rook to c5 goes after that pawn. So h4, and now Nepo goes after it with rook to h5, and now bishop to f6, just guarding this pawn. So while this allows some chances for black to push for the win, it also allows Nepo's rooks to just infiltrate the position. So rook to h7 check, king to f8, and now rook to d6. And now from that position where the rooks were just completely out of the reach of the black king, now it looks extremely dangerous. And now you could play bishop d5 to just defend this pawn and keep an eye on both of these pawns. Magnus first goes for bishop to e4, attacks the rook. We have rook to c7. Now again, it's very, very dangerous, but with the bishop covering the d8 square, it doesn't seem like you have all that much to worry about. So Magnus only now retreats the bishop to d5. Now this pawn is covered, this pawn is covered, and it seems like there's nothing to worry about. However, there is much to worry about, so feel free to pause the video here and try to find the absolutely crushing move for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the move that Magnus played in the game, which that Nepo played in the game, which is king to e3. But there is a much faster way on winning the game. So really congratulations to everyone who found this one, and that's just rook to d7, rook d to d7. This gets us control of the 7-track rank from the perspective of this rook, and now we are threatening rook to c8. So if you found this, you are really a true master of rook maneuvering. Just impossible to parry this position. And if king to e8, now not allowing this because king captures, we just play rook to h7, again threatening check. And then if bishop blocks, Sorry about those arrows. If bishop blocks, just rook h8 check, and that's it. We pick up the bishop, we win the game. And now, of course, if king to d8, again, not allowing this rook to be lifted, now we just play rook to f7. Attack this bishop. Once the bishop moves with check, you can see that now this check is possible. Probably why Nepo first played king to e3 before starting anything to avoid this check, but it doesn't really do all that much. King e2, and now after king to e8, again, not allowing any checkmating patterns. Now rook to c7. Again, we're threatening rook to c8, and now once again after king to d8, now we play f5, and that's it. Now this pawn is a monster. Of course, the pawn cannot be captured because this simple check picks up the bishop, and there's really nothing to worry about here. There's just no good way to play this. So you have to find all of these rook maneuvers, and then this pawn push with f5. In the actual game, king to e3 was played. It doesn't change all that much. It just allows black to defend a little bit longer. So king to e8. Now comes rook to h7, and now bishop to e7. This is now a little bit different, but again, it's completely winning. So once again, feel free to pause the video and win the game once again for Nepo while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations, especially if you found the first one as well. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is, of course, rook captures on d5. You could also start with rook to h8 check, that's fine, but rook captures on d5 is just game over on the spot. E captures on d5 was played, and now we have king to d4. And it's now a rook against the bishop, with the rook having absolutely everything covered. You can't bring the king into the game, you can't push this pawn. This pawn will fall, it's on a light square, so not much for you to do here. Magnus played bishop to d6, now just f5, and he was in this position on move 53 that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game, and an excellent victory for Jan Nepomniachtchi. So this is their third encounter. It's a 1 draw and 2 wins for Nepo. It doesn't make any sense to continue this because, well, you could play b6, but we don't care. We just can play king captures on d5, and if bishop to e7, just king e6. There's no playing this for black. If bishop to d8, to try and keep an eye on the pawn, we play rook h8 checkmate. So you either get checkmated or you avoid checkmate, and then you lose all the material, and then white simply pushes his pawn and promotes to a queen. So either way, you're just gonna lose this. So very nice game by both of them. Very interesting. First exchange sacrifice by Magnus, then another exchange sacrifice that was completely crazy. I mean, 2 bishops against 2 rooks, but he overpushed it, and then, you know, those rooks just found their way behind enemy lines, and that was more than enough for Nepo to win this game. But if you're wondering who won the under 14 World Championship, it was not Nepo, it was not Magnus, it was actually Sergei Zhigalko. We've shown a game between Magnus and him a few days ago, maybe even a week ago. That was a bullet game, so it was actually Sergei Zhigalko who won the tournament, followed by Maxim Vachier-Lagrave, Maxim Rothstein, only then Magnus Carlsen in 4th, and Nepo in 5th place. So as you can see, just because you're not on the top today doesn't mean you're not going to be tomorrow. So something maybe to take from this game. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that one, and that you are ready for the World Chess Championship match. It's still a month away, but you know, it's I haven't covered any of these previous first encounters between the two of them, so I thought you guys might enjoy that sort of as a prelude to this great event. Yeah, once again, really hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Eduardo, the American Flag Iglesias, Danny Green, David Kimura, Marshall Ferrier, and Jean-Francois Bond for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of you know, everything that's just happening in the chess world, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and of course preparing the next big saga, which is still a secret. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.